I absolutely love this question. It's one I use a lot, and it's what is the most complex system or product that you've ever had to design? I love it because it really exposes, specifically for product managers, but it really exposes how you think and how you gauge what's important to communicate in an interview. And it really, especially for the more senior level candidates that come through Interview At, this is a good level setting question for feedback to help them understand what's required the more senior they get. And in this specific case, it is a product manager person who's looking for a principal product manager role at Amazon. So two things are true. One, obviously I'm ex-Amazon. I was a director there running the Kindle team. So I understand pretty clearly what it takes to be a good principal product manager. I had a few on my team, but also promoted folks into that role. So what it takes to kind of move up into that role and how to describe the difference between a senior product manager and a principal product manager at Amazon. And so this entire interview is a very good case study of you can have an exceptional candidate or a very good candidate, which this person was kind of in the totality. This was actually the first question that I asked him. So there's a bit of nervousness and maybe a lack of preparedness going into the first question where you kind of, you're just not set for our mock interview. But it is a very good shining light example of how you could be a good, great, or even exceptional candidate. And based on what comes out of your mouth and what you choose to share to me, the interviewer, is going to gate how we level you. And in some cases, you could have a potentially very good candidate who just doesn't do a good enough job, as we'll see here, to communicating effectively the complexity of what they did, and thereby convincing me that I should feel comfortable pounding the table for this person in the room afterwards when we're discussing how the candidate did. Real quick, if you want to work with me or support the channel, the links are below.
What is the most complex system or product you've ever had to design?
Most complicated system or product I ever had to design.
Complex, not complicated, complex. Those are two different words.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So give me just a second here to tell you a couple of things. Sure. All right. I can tell you a story about the basically pricing algorithm and system that I built as part of my last startup. My last startup was Dormigo. It was a hospitality startup in the space of the shared home economy. What we did was basically property management for short-term rentals. Now, as part of me leading this company, at some point, we realized that the pricing was suboptimal. We were using external services that were dynamically changing our prices for each and one of our properties for the future, but I felt that we could do better. So
tell me a little bit more about that. You're using an external service that you were paying as a provider to dynamically change the prices that people were charging for their homes to use?
Correct, yes. In a way, to the dynamic pricing optimization for, if there's an increased demand somewhere, then the prices will increase. If there's less demand, it would slowly go down. But the thing is, it's an industry that most people don't really understand too much about pricing. They just want to get as much as they can. So there are services that are supposedly optimizing it for them. When I saw how it was working from my tech background and algorithms experience, I felt that this is a little maybe too simplistic and I probably can do better. And I decided to attack that and understand how others are doing it, why they're doing it that way, and if I could do better. And what I did was I read some articles, some research, talked to a lot of people in the field, and I realized that this industry is a little bit in the past. There's a lot of new things that can be done in around the area of machine learning or system optimization or recursive iterations that would improve things that might not be done optimally or even remotely optimally. So what I did is I decided to try my own. I built kind of an initial algorithm in Python to try to price things myself. I did some back testing, and of course there was a big risk associated with that because just shutting down your pricing, which is the main revenue of the business, and starting something else that you did, there's a huge risk. If I did some mistake or something like that, we could really ruin the revenue. So what I decided to do is once I got the system to a point I was relatively confident with it, I decided to run it on a small set of our properties, obviously, and keep it close, monitoring it closely. And And pretty quickly, it became obvious that things were working at least as well as before. And we started increasing the exposure a little bit more while I was repetitively improving the algorithm myself. And it was a great success because eventually when we benchmarked our system with the external services we've been using, we turned out that we were able to increase our revenue in around 10 to 20% per property, which was a huge difference for us. Now, the reason it was very complex is because I really dove in the subtleties of how pricing is done and how you could optimally, as early as possible, understand what the demand might be to certain areas. Obviously, you have different layers of how to optimally price. You have the days of the week, you have the seasonality of the year, you have the location, the type of property, a lot of things, the type of customer that might be in the area in those times of years. A lot of layers like that we were adding and adding and adding into the system when it was built in a way that allowed to add more and more things to consider. And with time, it became better and better to the point that we actually considered spinning off that product itself. I considered spinning it off to a separate company, which didn't happen eventually. And I sold this company. And I'm happy I did because I did it just before coronavirus hit, which we're very lucky. But yeah, this is, I would say, probably the most complex systems I ever built.
First things first, the difference between a complex thing and a complicated thing really comes down to the level of thinking required versus the number of steps. Complicated could mean it just took a lot of steps to get there. It was complicated. It was on interchangeable parts, different interactions need to occur. That is a complicated thing. A complex thing is it was a very hard problem to solve, and it required deep thinking, not complicated in the sense of precision of interaction, but rather thinking and solving. It's a subtle nuance, and in some cases it's probably being a bit pedantic, but just let's get that out of the way. This question is specifically focusing on the leadership principle of dive deep, right? Tell me, the interviewer, about a thing that you built and explain to me why it was complex. What I'm looking for as an interviewer is to understand, can you walk me through a thing that is difficult and hard and complex and required a lot of deep thinking and really focused a lot of energy on solving a problem, and then explain it to me in a way that I can walk out of the interview and understand what you built. The risk of staying at too high a level in an interview answer is that I kind of get it as an interviewer, but you didn't provide me enough detail to actually convince me that you did the work and that you understood the complexity and that you solved the problem. And in this specific answer, it was a decent start for sure, but there were a lot of claims thrown around and a lot of discussion points that were just kind of too high level to really sell me on the fact that this individual solved the problem. Now, that's a function of what he's willing to share, or what you as the candidate are willing to share. He may very well have done all the work, but when you say things like AI and ML wasn't being used, machine learning wasn't being used, so I built some Python code. There's more to that story, right? Did you build Python code from scratch? Did you use recurrent neural networks? Did you use scikit-learn? Did you just do basic regressive logistical regression? Like, how did you, like, what did you do? Like, what was the algorithm you used? How did you approach the problem? What were the challenges you faced? Because as he walks through the problem, if you have a understanding of machine learning, you'll hear him say that he basically used different measures. And the table of measures, the features got more complex, and that allowed him to make better pricing decisions. Okay, fine. So it was a predictive analysis tool, but I understand that. Someone may not in an interview. So you just have to do a better job of laying out what you did and laying out the complexities, that I walk out of there thinking, this person's a deep thinker. This person's really, really bright. This person can work on really hard problems. Not this person's talking about a thing that he might have gone to the developers and said, hey, we should use machine learning to solve this problem. And the developer said, cool. And they went off and did something. And then they came back and they said, here, it works and it's better. And he's like, awesome. Because when he talks about it was 10 to 20% better, that's a pretty broad range. How did he know that it was the changes they made were directly attributable to their code? What tests did they put in place? What measurements did they have? Like, there's a lot of missing data here that really highlights the importance for you as the candidate to provide the information. Don't leave it to me the interviewer, to ask you the follow-up questions. You have to assume that I'm a dumb person who is super busy and doesn't know your space, and therefore I'm not going to ask the smart follow-up question. And if you don't provide it, it makes it really hard to have that kind of intelligent discussion that follows.
Well, so I have a couple of follow-up questions. First, what data did you have to know that the providers weren't already using machine learning and artificial intelligence? Like, what made you made that as a very bold claim, and it seems, unless you're in the companies, how do you know they weren't using that?
That's a great question. I was actually able to relatively easily reverse engineer their algorithm to the point that I was able to see how their pricing is going to work. And I noticed that they were using pretty simple mechanisms that are not very advanced. They would do things like a weight of every day of the week that was pretty clear. And once the area was above a certain occupancy, then they decided to increase by a certain percentage rate. And I basically reverse engineered what they were doing, and it turned out that it wasn't changing as often or according to what I would expect if things were really changing. For example, one thing that I really wanted to solve is that, let's say there's suddenly a conference of, I don't know, tailors in this neighborhood, and then all the area is really picking up demand. No other system would ever know that because of the way that they work. They expect known events, and they only if like your occupancy is really, really high, then they are say, okay, maybe there's some demand going on here with other properties. And for us, what I wanted was that even if I don't know what is happening, the system will still recognize just by the hint of an increased demand, it will already understand what's going to happen. And so by reverse engineering what they were doing, that's how I got a good sense of how they were doing things. That's one side of it. The other side is that from my experience in the hotel industry, I just started talking to people who are in charge of pricing in hotels, in other property management companies like mine. And it became clear that people are not really diving deep into the mechanics of pricing. They're just trying to find solutions that are easy for them to use and going with their intuition, but not really in a rigorous, I guess, algorithmic way. If that makes sense.
This is certainly going to be the case for a more senior level product manager. In this case, this person was going for a principal product manager level role at Amazon, which is it's more like a director at most companies, a really small startup. It might even be a VP level talent and experience. So that's going to gate the kind of feedback that I'm giving in this specific answer. And it's an extremely bold claim to say that I, as an individual, reverse engineered these various companies, how they were doing their pricing algorithm. How do you even know that? Right? How do you know what their data inputs were? It's a very bold claim that the candidate doesn't really back up at all. And he then goes on to make the claim that they didn't, if there was a conference coming to town, they, meaning the people they were using for their pricing adjustments, weren't taking into account an uptick in demand. How does he know that? Like, it might just be that it's a slow process, or demand was a lower weighted input. It could be the case that the company that they were using did in fact use demand, but they didn't weight it as strongly because #reasons. It really depends, and especially if this company is selling to a bunch of different people that are using this specific thing, it might be a single deployed model that they don't want to touch because their other customers are saying, look, we don't want that much variability in our pricing because our customers get really upset if the prices move around too much. In this specific case, it may very well be true that he was able to reverse engineer their algorithm and decided that it was insufficient, and he went off and built a new thing with his folks. All of that may be true, but the claims are just so bold without any sufficient supporting data as to the what, the why, the how, that in listening to this answer, as an interviewer, I'm just kind of scratching my chin going, gosh, is this guy, is he making smart decisions, or has he decided on what the answer is, and now he's using kind of data and circumstance to support his claim, and it's really not quite the truth, and that can be problematic, especially the more senior you get in organizations, right? Because you want to be able to support your claims and be able to speak across an organization to the many different stakeholders that you have to work with to be able to convince them of your point of view, and so there's just in this case, very specifically, not enough detail presented to give me, the interviewer, confidence and comfort that this person operating at this level is making really good decisions for, we'll call it a very senior role at a large company.
It does, and I get the people that you were competing against. If they were providers in the hotel space, it's probably just overly simplistic. But there's a couple of things you said in there that I want to kind of poke at. First, machine learning and artificial intelligence is kind of an overloaded set of terms, and really it all comes down to math, a black box that we just call math, right? And statistics, fine. And what you're telling me is that perhaps they weren't using the right features in their analysis, not that they weren't using AI. It's just that it was overly simple, right? For example, they gave it a certain set of features, and then its math went and figured out how to weight those features, and it went. But in suggesting that because it wasn't able to take in, I don't know, a number of searches on the site for a given area, spiking it in an unsupervised learning kind of way, it might have picked that up. But you're telling me they probably use a supervised model, which is, no, here's the data we have, and this is all you get to use, which is fine. And so I won't knock that, but I think your conclusion is wrong. But the statement that they want simple, I get that. So let's talk about that then, right? So you talked a little bit about what made your answer or your solution complex, and there's still, it's a little light on the details as to why it was like complex, like what one thing made it really complex. But if they wanted simple, why complex? Like, help me bridge the gap as a product manager. Help me bridge the gap between what they were getting, what they wanted, and what you delivered.
Sure. So what they want is, from my understanding and researching it, what they want is always just something very simple that they will basically not have to touch at all. Ideally, that they will be confident that it gives them it maximizes their revenue or their profits the best way possible. That's what the client wants. Now, in terms of how what you give them, I found that these services are giving them solutions that are maybe are kind of behind the curve of what is happening, meaning they're reacting to the market instead of trying to find hints and almost predict what's going to happen. I mean, we're both the existing algorithms that were working in other solutions and ours, we're trying to predict what is going to happen and increase the price. But I felt that the way they were doing it, they were waiting for too many things to happen, and it's too little too late of a change. And the way we were doing it, or the way I built the algorithm, was that it was trying to predict the statistics of how the booking is supposed to behave in advance. And from the very, very first indication that there's maybe a little too many bookings, even if it's 3 months in advance, just 2 or 3 bookings that were maybe a little too many in the same area to close already would spike the price much more significantly and maybe more aggressively, because it would already understand, oh, there's something going on there. Whether other platforms are a little more waiting for really major things to happen, and it was really obvious and clear that there's a lot of demand. And now, okay, maybe we'll increase the price a little bit. So I guess I went about it in a different goal of how I want to predict what is going to happen as early as possible in the process and not wait for things to already happen.
The unanswered question here that I would want to ask as an interviewer, but would press if I was a product leader in this company, was, how are you so certain that this company or companies that you're using for the external pricing adjustments hasn't already tried what you're proposing and what were their results, right? The default position of someone who just jumps into building without maybe necessarily talking to customers or thinking through the practical realities of what they're trying to do is an assumption that their idea is novel and correct. Novel meaning it hasn't been tried, correct meaning it's going to work. Based on the statement that this was a 10 to 20% improvement, I think it's fair to say that, yeah, okay, if that's true, then this worked. However, to this point in the interview, the candidate really hasn't presented a lot of data or even details to necessarily support that they really understood what had been done, defining what they're trying to do and how that's different. And when I say define, I mean in a technical sense. And then make the case that it was something to expend resources on. And that's where this gets a little bit tougher for me as an interviewer, for this senior level, a candidate, to be excited and confident about them for the role.
how did you know what you were doing was better? And it's going to be a very and I'm gonna stop you before you answer the way you're probably going to answer, which is optimizing revenue. Sure, but that there's going to be a bunch of other metrics involved in getting to that answer. So what metrics were you using to know that you were doing better?
To be clear, in this one, I definitely will raise my hand and say I was trying to help the candidate. And most interviewers will not do this. But I was trying to stop them from giving me the blurt out answer and actually asking them to think a little bit more.
Question, and this is actually a very difficult problem that we had. How do we check that if we shut everything down or use our system versus the existing ones, it was a third party, how do we know what works better? It's because we cannot have, if we have one apartment that is being booked, either it's using your system or someone else, it's hard to benchmark them both. So it wasn't easy to do. What we did was we found a way to kind of take a period of time that we had bookings in a set of apartments with one system versus another, and we found a way to, in a way, normalize the revenue so that we have the same benchmark to compare kind of a basis of revenue. And that into that benchmark went the seasonality, the average revenue of each property in the past, and we were able to, and the idea was to get to compare apples to apples, which was not easy at all. But the way to do that was to normalize what happened with one system and run the other in parallel for a different set of properties. And with this normalization, we were able to eventually compare apples to apples, what would better. And we were able to find that almost consistently, my algorithm was giving us 10 to 20% higher revenue over time than the other one. And as we gained confidence, we started increasing the properties we're using my algorithm versus the third party, and we kept testing it to make sure that it stays the same, and it was pretty steady.
There's a recognition by the candidate that this is a nuanced answer, and he's starting to demonstrate a nuanced understanding of what was needed, which is great. But there's a lack of conviction in how he's presenting his results. It may be correct what he's done, but the way he's presenting it is not convincing me as the interviewer that he understands what and why and how to measure the results. It feels like, and again, I'm basing this 100% on what came out of his mouth, not I have the ability to look into his brain and understand the truth of it. What comes out of his mouth is presenting in a way that it's almost like he's giving a book report on a book that he kind of read, meaning some people did some work based on his assertion as a product manager, we need to do X, Y, and Z. But he didn't really understand what was done. And now he's talking about the results of that, and I don't want to say taking credit, but he's explaining it in a way as like he did the work, but he doesn't really understand the work. And again, I'm 100% basing this on what has come out of his mouth. And the key takeaway for you as a candidate is, I, as the interviewer, am only meeting you for between 45 and 60 minutes. I may have looked at your resume, I may have looked at your LinkedIn, maybe, but the reality is this is the window of time that you have to convince me that you can do this job at this company and likely exceed expectations. And in this specific instance, this candidate is simply flying at too high a level for such a senior level role to really convince me that they're diving deep, which is the point of the question. The whole point of the question is to demonstrate he built a complex thing or was involved in building a complex thing. And in doing that, can explain it to me so that I come away with a reasonable understanding that this person can do the work. And up to this point, it's not quite getting there.
So how did you do that? How did you account for and actually execute the normalization?
That's a great question. I need to think about this a little bit, but the general idea was that you have a set of data that fluctuates a lot and it's supposed to, with the day of the week, with the the time of year, with maybe certain events that are happening, and the way we normalized it is, I think what we did was we took each property separately. We basically averaged out the revenue that property, I guess the price fluctuations that property had and the revenue it brought up to the same level. Meaning if some property did on average $500 per day and some other did $200, we normalized them both to be, let's say, 100 with their fluctuations, and each property got some kind of a score of how it's normalized. And then we had one benchmark for all of our properties up to a certain point in time. And from that certain point in time, some of the properties we continued using the other algorithm, and some of them we used mine. And we watched how that normalized value is now changing over time, one set of properties versus the other. And that benchmark is what we compared.
I've kind of beat to death the idea that he's not providing enough details. Fine, we understand that. I want to re-anchor that in this idea that the more senior level role that you're going for, the more that is expected of you. And in this specific case, it was going for a principal level product manager at Amazon. And having been a director at Amazon, I understand what's required for that role, and what's required to, for an external hire as well as to promote into that role. And for Dive Deep, this candidate's simply not doing enough. And that last question was really meant as a kind of a checkpoint for me as the interviewer to really gauge, did this person do the work? Or are they reporting back on someone else's work? This notion about normalization of data and walking me through it, it could be that it was so far back in time that he doesn't have the story at the ready, and that's a preparation problem for the candidate. It could also be that he had prepared the story but hadn't really thought through how to talk about in any level of depth because he didn't have the foundational elements, meaning he did the work. That might also be true. I'm not trying to impugn the candidate here. What I am saying is that as a person who's attempting to prepare for an interview, or actually in the interview, it is your job to convince me that you did the work, and that, or in the case where you're presenting is you did the work, that you did the work and that you understand the work and you can speak extensively about the work and not remain at such a high level that what presents to me as the interviewer is that I don't know that he did the work. And that's the problem. If I now jump ahead to what the feedback I would have read for this candidate had I been on the loop, what I wrote was, overall, the candidate did an okay job in walking through this answer block. The main issue was that the depth of field was not sufficient for someone expecting to take on a senior role at a more established company. The candidate presented as being aware of the details, but not necessarily driving them. As a result, the data and solutions provided were done so with only sufficient depth and not exemplary depth, thus not giving the impression that the candidate can truly dive deep. And that's the problem. You have to remember, it doesn't matter if you're interviewing at Amazon or any other company. The question governs what the company or the interviewer is actually looking for. And in this specific case, walk me through the most complex thing you've ever built. What we as the interviewers or as a company interviewing you are looking for is, can you take on sufficiently difficult challenges, break them down, understand what the conditions for success are, and then chart a path for how to get there and walk me through what you did. This is your opportunity to shine, and it requires thinking about how to get into the weeds, but not so far into the weeds, right? More often than not, you're gonna hear people say, don't get in the weeds. But in a question like this, it is almost required that you get into the weeds, but not so much that it detracts from the overall point of the question. And in this case, I would say that, it's, like I said at the beginning, this was the first question block. So maybe the candidate's a little nervous, and it's fine. All of those things are true. He got better as he went. He's actually a very good candidate, I think, overall. I think he'd be a bit challenged for principal product manager at Microsoft, given how he presented in this interview. But I would say, extrapolating out based on all the other discussions, pretty good candidate. It's on you. It's 100% on you. And this is a great example of you can do good, but not great. And unfortunately, good's just not good enough.